Hello there everyone, I am your host, the Sea Monster. In 1984, an era of Godzilla films known as the Heisei era was ushered in with the release of The Return of Godzilla. From then on, Toho would go on to release 6 sequels to it that span onward until 1995. This particular string of Godzilla films has been considered to be a favorite for many fans in the Goji community, with many entries in said era being deemed as their particular favorites, and understandably so, as a good number of these films truly are some of the best. And I'm just gonna stop right there because we all know why we're really here. For you see, despite how good or even great some films in the Heisei era were, there are others that don't hold up to scrutiny all that well. And one of those entries that doesn't hold up is none other than the subject of this particular essay video, which I am doing here. Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, the third entry in the Godzilla Heisei series, released in 1991 and written and directed by Katsuki Omori. Now sure, many folks out there have reviewed this film in the past. In fact, I'll be making points that are not too dissimilar to what others have made before me. However, the film has such a staggering amount of issues in its story and its characters that it's astounding, and whether they've been previously mentioned or not, they're all still worth mentioning nonetheless. And I know that this film, much like the rest of the Heisei era, is likely a personal favorite for some of you out there, and that's perfectly fine. But let's not kid ourselves here. This is not a Godzilla film that I would ever want to see be viewed as one that meets the golden standard, no pun intended, of what the franchise can provide or achieve. And hopefully this video will make a strong case as to why that's so. And now, without further ado, let's begin. For the uninitiated, a brief summary is in order so that we can have a rough idea of what we're dealing with here in this video. So, let's get into that, shall we? Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah is set primarily in the year 1992, a few years after the events of Godzilla vs. Biollante. Japan finds itself visited by a trio of Futurians, humans from the distant future, named Wilson, Grenchiko, and Emmy, who have come on their own accord to warn the government about its country's inevitable destruction by none other than Godzilla. And so, a small expedition consisting of Emmy, sci-fi writer Kenichiro Terasawa, Professor Mazaki, and Heisei-era regular Miki all go back in time to World War II, where the Futurians' work is done to prevent the birth of Godzilla as we know him. However, this plan to undo Godzilla's origins also came with a caveat that involves the Futurians creating their own monster named King Ghidorah in Godzilla's stead, which causes Emmy to turn her back on her colleagues and try to help in stopping them. More on that later. So now Japan's fate hangs in the balance with the return of Godzilla, no not the movie, being its only chance of being able to crawl out from under the Futurians' boot. And from then on, further hijinks ensue, which ranges from Godzilla fighting King Ghidorah to scenes that make the film look like a cheap Terminator knockoff, to even more time-traveling antics that result in the creation of Mecha King Ghidorah, a cyborg version of the three-headed dragon that is introduced into the fray in order to quell Godzilla once he starts attacking Japan. So, long story short, a pretty bonkers plot. But don't you worry, folks. It's somehow even more bonkers in practice than on paper, and not exactly in a good way as we're about to find out. So the first thing that I want to get into is how time travel is incorporated into the film's plot. Poorly, I might add. Now, try to stick with me, folks, because I want to go through this part first due to how dense it all is. So the film establishes that the Godzilla which we've followed since the return of Godzilla was also the dinosaur that was on Lagos Island, that would go on to be moved into the Bering Sea by the Futurians in 1944. However, in return, Heisei Goji didn't first appear in Lagos, but rather it was Daikoku Island. So, if the dinosaur became Heisei Goji in 1954, how could he exist for all that time without being discovered at any point between the 30-year gap between the events of 54 and the events of Return? That being said, trust me when I say that even that is among the least of this movie's problems, as we will soon find out. So let's just set that detail off to the side, shall we? Anyways, moving right along. So the Futurians tried to change history by relocating the dinosaur in order to prevent Japan from becoming the most powerful nation on Earth. More powerful than the Earth Union, and Wilson and Grenchiko lied about the country being in danger of being destroyed by Godzilla in the near future. And so, present-day Japan gives the Futurians the okay to change history, only for the Futurians to create Ghidorah in Godzilla's place, much to Emmy's dismay, who goes on to tell Terasawa and the rest the truth about Japan's future. However, when the dinosaur was moved to the Bering Sea, a Russian submarine went missing in the 1970s, implying that the dinosaur got turned into Godzilla as a result of the sub's nuclear waste. Godzilla then gets an extra boost of power thanks to Shindo's sub in present day. More on that later. So, if we are to go off of this, the dinosaur was going to become Godzilla no matter what the Futurians did. Either by them screwing up on the mission from jump, or by them accidentally being the catalyst of the thing which they sought to erase. Oh, and we also have a King Ghidorah that apparently was around the whole time thanks to the Futurians' antics, that's just chilling somewhere, supposedly undiscovered or unacknowledged, neither by Godzilla nor Japan. Or, heck, any other country throughout the period of 1944 all the way into 1992. So, one would think, okay, so Japan is still gonna get that golden age, right? Nope, apparently not, because according to the old guy who Emmy speaks to in 2204, Godzilla is gonna go on to destroy Japan, all of its nuclear plants, and the works anyways, which was the very thing that the Futurians lied about in the first place. So basically, the film wants us to believe, based on what we are shown and told, that the dinosaur was going to transform into Godzilla no matter what the Futurians did, whether they do so by accident or otherwise, and that history couldn't really be altered in any meaningful way. Ergo, what we're seeing here is a stable time loop, which could explain why everyone still remembers Godzilla despite the attempted change, and despite how history was supposed to have changed for the purposes of preventing Godzilla's existence. Now the following, which I'm about to read to you all, is an explanation of how a stable time loop works as quoted in tvtropes.org. Even if it were possible to travel back in time, you would not be able to change any events in the past, because your future self will have already caused them to happen in any way that they did. No matter your intentions, everything that you did would only fulfill the past. Now, if we are to go off of that and go off of the notion that the timeline cannot be altered no matter what the Futurians did, then how could King Ghidorah even be a possibility if a stable time loop would suggest that the dinosaur was going to become Godzilla on Lagos Island no matter what? In fact, based on the logic of the stable time loop theory, Japan should become a world superpower no matter what the Futurians did, but instead the film wants us to believe that Japan would be destroyed by Godzilla before that would even happen, just as the Futurians lied about, which goes against what the stable time loop theory suggests would be the case. So in short, the Futurians went back in time to change history only to create the very thing they were trying to erase, thus Japan would have its economic boom without being attacked by Godzilla. But once we flash forward to where Emmy is salvaging Ghidorah's body in 2204, the old Earth Union fellow tells her that Godzilla did end up destroying Japan and that golden age never happened. How could this even be a stable time loop where history is ultimately unaltered as the writer intended to be so, if history itself was altered? Make that make sense, please. And with that being the case, despite my best interest in trying to make sense out of this mess, we cannot suggest that there are branching timelines if we assume that Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah is basing its mechanics off the stable time loop theory. Because otherwise, we wouldn't have the likes of the Futurians and their subsequent creations having access to the timelines from which they started out in, considering that the Futurians don't have the technological means to access the potential multiple timelines beyond the one in which they inhabit. On that note, the Futurians can only teleport objects from place to place within the time which they are currently inhabiting, and not from place to place between two different points in time. So they can't even teleport King Ghidorah forward into 1992, which they started out in, once he's created by the H-bomb in 54. Which means we have a King Ghidorah that's just hanging around and somehow never acknowledged by the rest of the world between 44 and 92, when the Futurians are fully able to enact their plan, assuming that he's not even in a separate timeline altogether that's entirely inaccessible / erased. The only acknowledgement of things being different from the original timeline pre-time travel is that Godzilla is described as much bigger than he was before. Oh, and that he's unfriendly, as stated eloquently by Wilson, which is pretty priceless because Godzilla, as he's been shown in 1954 and the Heisei era up to this point, was never depicted as friendly whatsoever. So really, the Futurians plan to erase Godzilla from history by relocating his past self during World War II can't even remotely work based on all this. Granted, we haven't even got to the logistics of the plan itself, broken time travel mechanics aside, but let's save that for later, shall we? Now, this next bit isn't necessarily related to time travel mechanics, but rather just how the filmmakers completely bend the rules of the world backwards in order to set up a certain payoff. So, in order for Emmy to eventually create Mecha King Ghidorah, Ghidorah's near-lifeless body has to fall into the ocean outside of Japan and become frozen in order to be well preserved. Thus calling us back to the opening scene in 2204 where Emmy and a member of the Earth Union go down to recover the three-headed beast. Never mind the fact that there would be all sorts of marine life, whether it be sharks or even bacteria, that would reduce Ghidorah's body into bones to the point where his carcass would be beyond salvaging. The fact that the Sea of Okhotsk only gets to freezing temperatures between October and March results in this plot point making even less sense when the plot requires the seawater to be consistently freezing all year round for over 200 years in order for Mecha King Ghidorah to be created for the final battle. In order for Ghidorah to be frozen properly and kept in good enough condition to be a viable template for a cyborg kaiju, we're talking Antarctica levels of freezing temperatures, and he would have to be in solid ice, as opposed to being just under cold water, in order to be well preserved, as the film wants us to believe is the case. Which, yeah, ain't no way is the water surrounding Japan ever gonna get that cold. So in short, the film actively defies logic in order to have the cool as heck visual spectacle of a cyborg Ghidorah fighting Godzilla at the very end, meaning that the film's writing has to take significant hits in order for certain payoffs to occur. And this, dear viewers, is not the only example of where this happens in the film, as we will soon go into.
And, Fresh Maj, I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing your name wrong. Timeline 3 humans. Oh, good lord. Do we need to discuss the timeline stuff?
Oh god, no.
Oh.
It's a mess. That's all I can say. It's a mess.
Yeah, it's like all I can like. The thing about the timeline thing is like, so I'm not even sure if I should even address this in my video of mine. I probably should, but like just kind of the fact that the way with Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, the way it just establishes the timeline, it is so just confusing. Like the best I could do is just kind of name off like what could potentially be contradictory about it. The fact that Ghidorah, if he was created in 1954, with the Dorats being placed instead of the dinosaur to get nuked, and become a monster, like shouldn't that timeline be like inaccessible
or erased?
Yeah, it's like the Futurians showed up in the original timeline, as the original Heisei timeline, just to be clear, so we aren't talking about the Showa era, which, the beginning of Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah pre-time travel is set in the same continuity as Biollante and Return to Godzilla, what have you. But then after they move the Godzilla source from Lagos to the Bering Sea, and then they put the Dorats there, how are the Futurians even able to like get Ghidorah from the new timeline to the timeline that they're like currently in? Because keep in mind, the teleportation devices is not the teleportation device that they use for that control ship. It moves things from place to place, but not from one timeline to another. It's only within the timeline that they're currently inhabiting. We see that with the Godzillasaurus, and we see that with the Futurian mothership when it gets teleported to Godzilla. So, like, there's nothing in the film to suggest that that they would have been able to move Ghidorah after he's created in 1954. Moved from the timeline that they just created to the timeline they started out at.
Oh, my head hurts. Oh, dear. Oh my god.
There's two ways of looking at this. One, an actual very recent example was the Loki show. I don't know if you've seen, EFAP's videos on it more than anything else, where they have.
Yeah, I refuse to watch that show. It's Loki.
Yeah, don't buy Disney Plus.
I won't.
But yeah, on EFAP's one of these, they have Short Round's character is introduced to Loki and oh god, what's his name? Mr. Wow. Everybody probably knows him as
Owen Wilson.
That's him. They're introduced to him, and then Loki has a time flism and goes back in time to then meet Ouroboros back in time. And then there's two conversations going on at the quote-unquote same time, but in different times, to the point where Owen Wilson says to Ouroboros, which is Short Round's character, can you make the doodad that we need to help Loki? And Short Round says, no, I can't. Cut to the past conversation, and Loki says, can you start making that device now so it's ready when we turn up later? And Short Round's like, yeah, sure. Cut back to the future, and Short Round says, no, I can't. Wait. No, I have. And then he picks it up out from underneath his desk.
My head.
The other way of thinking it is, it doesn't make sense, don't even try.
It was 100% the one where he was displaced. Okay. Yeah, where the Godzillasaurus was displaced, I guess. Well, the thing is about that is that we got to keep in mind there's two Godzillas. You got the one from 1954, Gojira, which we can imply is the one from that was on Lagos Island that they moved. But then you have the second Godzilla show up in Return of Godzilla, that we see going on. How would the Futurians have not known that? How would the Futurians have not known that there were two Godzillas? Especially if they have all this history, all this access to this history.
That is unfortunately a big sticking point.
Yeah. Yeah,
I think they say in the film, again, I watched them recently and I was paying attention, sort of, to a point. I think they say because the UFO hovers above where Godzilla is, and then the future people actually say, yes, we've analysed Godzilla's DNA and bone marrow and skin samples and whatever the hell else they said, and this is definitely the same creature.
Yeah.
So at which point it's like, well, maybe that Godzilla was a different. Maybe the 54 Godzilla was another Godzilla, and the one they moved was the return of Godzilla. No, they confirm it. That's the same one.
Apparently, there's a detail in Godzilla vs. Destroyer where I think they said something about that it was that the Godzilla that it was a second Godzilla, where they kind of confirmed that. But that could be.
Oh no, yeah. The Return of Godzilla is a different Godzilla. They confirm that. They say, yeah, this is a different one. But the Futurians scanned the Godzilla from Godzilla vs. Biollante and confirmed it was the same creature as the dinosaur from the island. I probably should have made that more clear.
But then, wait a minute, that contradicts Biollante because the Godzilla from Return to Godzilla fell into that volcano. The volcano, and in Biollante, that Godzilla emerges from that volcano. Like, it's that same one. So that...
Yes.
Oh, dear.
Oh,
That makes sense.
Yeah, just so that we're very clear. Return to Godzilla falls in a volcano, and Godzilla vs. Biollante, he appears up from the volcano. Then you get to 1992, Futurians scan where the Godzilla is with the anti-nuclear bacteria in the water, just kind of chilling out. And they pretty much say that this is the Godzilla that is on Lagos Island. Oh god. Okay.
It starts
I'm
getting
sorry.
complicated when you start looking at the details.
Yeah.
Oh, dear.
At first, I remember when I was younger, I assumed that at first I assumed that they actually did erase Godzilla from history, and then somehow Godzilla came back from history, and then I was like, oh, wait a second. It's not that they erased Godzilla from history, it's that it's a closed loop, so they ultimately still create Godzilla, regardless of what happens. But then I realized it's technically a closed loop, but it happens across several different universes, and that's how you get the time travel to work somewhat well.
Yeah.
Somewhat.
Yeah. There's still problems.
Somewhat. That's being
You got the
generous.
original Godzilla who died, and then the Godzilla who came back in '84 was the Godzilla that was created when they moved the dinosaur. And the dinosaur they moved wasn't actually the original Godzilla. It was just a different there was another dinosaur on another island that just happened to also be nuked. But then the second dinosaur turned into the second Godzilla, which turned up in '84. And then you start thinking about Ghidorah and
Yeah, because the problem with it is that with the first timeline, it's implied that obviously the first Godzilla is the 54 one. The 54 one dies. The 84 one shows up, so then we don't know exactly how that one shows up, but we learn later on that once the dinosaurs move, that's where you get the 84 Godzilla becoming a thing in the first place. And it's only the sub that goes down to go look for Godzilla that we end up having a supercharged Godzilla. But then they have to go back to the future, which is a different timeline to ask to that is formed from this new Godzilla being even more powerful to create Mecha King Ghidorah, who comes back to the other timeline to then seal away Godzilla. But then we don't know what happens to the other timeline where they brought Mecha King Ghidorah from, because Emmy says she's going to her old timeline, which is the first timeline, and not the other branch off ones that they made.
I know they say, oh, Godzilla's gone. Now Ghidorah has everything. I can't remember if they said Ghidorah is in his place.
Well, yeah, they say Godzilla has vanished and King Ghidorah has taken his place.
There's just so many holes in that film that's like, I feel like there's so many holes in like how the time travel logistics or timeline logistics.
And then here's the other thing too. The other problem is that if King Ghidorah was debated, what's it called? Since King Ghidorah was mutated in the like 40s/50s, that technically means King Ghidorah was trouncing about on Earth for like a long time before he even technically activated in the modern day.
That's the thing. That's kind of the thing. It's like the film doesn't even like.
Actually, yeah. Wait a second. How is it that they know King Ghidorah exists now?
Yeah, and how do they keep like? And also, if this is like a new time, okay, so.
Whoa!
God.
Oh, because here's the other problem too: is that when you think about it, hypothetically, let's just say everything's a closed loop. So technically, King Ghidorah was always mutated on Lagos Island, meaning that either King Ghidorah was under like water for so long and just never activated until the Futurians woke him up to do so and found that he was still there, or that no one ever went to Lagos Island and realized King Ghidorah was on that island. Because if we're saying that this is a closed loop, the King Ghidorah was always there. The Futurians were always going to go back in time, and the events that happened in the 50s were never tampered with by the Futurians then, so that technically everything works fine, but still you have problems.
Yeah.
Because ultimately, it doesn't explain why Mecha King Ghidorah didn't come earlier to stop Godzilla until that one moment.
Yeah.
And the thing is that also you could still have that happen, but not have to worry about like you just need like a little bit of exposition to explain why like time travel comes back at only certain points, like something like whatever energy that powers the time machines, if there's too much of it in a certain point, it messes with the space-time continuum, so you have to like judge it out by certain periods. So if there's too much time travel activity, you blah blah blah, stuff like that. Like there's stuff you could say to justify it in universe. It's still going to be exposition and people may not like it, but at least like it makes sense.
So yeah, we're not exactly doing too great here because there's already so much wrong with the time travel mechanics in this film, for instance. But perhaps the characters will help salvage this whole thing. So, with that said, let's get into them. First, we have Mr. Shindo, the former commander of a garrison of Japanese troops stationed on Lagos Island that was narrowly saved by the dinosaur that would become Godzilla from the US forces, whom he shows a level of appreciation for. Shindo is arguably one of the better written characters, or at least the characters with some of the most potential for being better written, in terms of having a sense of nuance to him. But, given the bar this film sets, saying that Shindo is one of its better written characters isn't exactly high praise by any means. The scene where Shindo faces Godzilla and reminisces on their past back on Lagos before being obliterated by the giant creature is considered by many fans to be the highlight of the film. The scene is often cited as emotionally powerful, well acted, and strongly meaningful, with a lot of layers to dive into in terms of Shindo's overall view on Godzilla, and the tragic irony of how his savior ultimately became his destroyer in the end. I do agree that it is a good scene that's especially made even more effective thanks to Akira Ifukube's excellent score, but it's only this good if we don't think about how we got here. Now, I'm gonna have to save my further elaboration on this point for later on, but trust me, I have an Endgame planned for it later on, so for now, just remember this part, okay? Okay, good. Anyways, moving along. The big issue with Shindo, though, or at least the big issue surrounding him, is that his corporation's assets are what facilitate the second half of the film, as well as the title fight. When his privately owned submarine, armed with nuclear weapons, is patrolling in another country's waters, when it encounters and gets destroyed by Godzilla, thus facilitating his power boost. By the way, folks, the sub is over there just in case another country decides to start attacking Japan. Oh boy. Oh, where do we start? Actually, here's a good place to start. First off, no matter how rich and prominent one may be, no citizen of Japan is going to be allowed to own a nuclear sub without the government being aware of it, let alone putting him on their radar or even on a watch list. Secondly, if the sub was constructed and deployed while the Cold War was still going on, Shindo could have started World War III if any nation that was an active participant in the Cold War was made aware of this thing's mere existence. We don't even need the return of Godzilla to be canon in order for Cold War tensions to be something that Japan would have common knowledge and concerns about, since they sit directly between the US and the USSR. And for Japan to not want any of their denizens, no matter their wealth or seat in power, to do anything that could kick the hornet's nest here. Third, Shindo goes on to say that this was kept secret so he knew that he would get into some kind of trouble for this, but he did it anyways. It's a convenience in the plot that the sub exists in the first place to facilitate the events to come. However, it wasn't for Godzilla or any giant monster that could rise up, but rather it was in case another nation decided to threaten war against Japan. if a country did decide to go to war against Japan, then what in Godzilla's green hollow earth would make Shindo believe that he would have the authority to participate in said war just because he owns a bunch of nukes? And fourth, there are international laws put in place for Japan to not even have nuclear weapons, only weapons that are to be used for self-defense. So basically, weapons that fall into a class far beneath nuclear weapons. So Shindo, owning a nuclear sub and hiding it in another nation's territory, would put his own country in jeopardy if other nations were made aware of it. The government officials' reaction to this bombshell, no pun intended, seems pretty mild here when we consider this tidbit of info. I understand that they have a lot on their plate with Ghidorah and the Futurians currently laying waste to their country, but the fact that Shindo gets nothing more than a slap on the wrist for this is kind of absurd, especially considering the risk there is of another country uncovering this secret and charging Japan for a multitude of violations, if not said country threatening to go to war against Japan for this. Oh, good grief. I didn't even realize how utterly busted this plot point alone truly is. Not only that, but the film fails to realize that Shindo could have inadvertently destroyed his own country just by owning this submarine. It's such a shame too, because Shindo, on paper, has such an intriguing story that could have been mined from in a meaningful way. An old veteran who sees Godzilla as a tragic hero figure for Japan due to an experience involving him back in World War II, who then lives to see that same protector go on to be Japan's doom as a result of its folly. This veteran, despite knowing all this, still comes to respect Godzilla enough for what he did for him in the past to let himself be destroyed by him. This subplot as a concept, as well as Shindo as a character, could have been really good, and it could have given the film that extra oomph. Too bad the logistics for how we got this subplot are as busted as they are, and it's also a shame that even Shindo's story, despite being intended to be part of the film's emotional heft, is only kind of a side note compared to what we are apparently supposed to be emotionally invested in. Speaking of which...
Weirdly, it's something that everybody addresses in King Ghidorah, because obviously you have to address it. But because of the here is our new special weapon gimmick in most of the Heisei era, the submarine, that was it. The submarine in Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah is the special weapon. They go, we need something to irradiate the Godzillasaurus. Don't worry, we have a secret nuclear submarine that's privately owned and stored somewhere secret. It's definitely not massively internationally illegal.
It's high. It's like, and they hid it in like somewhere within another country's territory. Like Shindo, like depending on when this sub was built and when they just had it out there, how long it's been out there. It could have been potentially like years before '92. Shindo could have potentially have started World War III just by doing that, considering that Cold War would have been still going on at the time.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, think about Return of Godzilla. That sub goes down, and World War III is about to be declared.
Yeah.
So, if someone accidentally saw a nuclear submarine sitting somewhere, they would have raised the alarm in World War III.
Oh yes, absolutely.
But it's the other issue of Japan wasn't allowed they have a self-defense force. That's what they're allowed. It is actually, I brought this up in Fractured Diamond. They don't have a lot of the tech that most other countries do because they're not allowed. They're only allowed a self-defense force, so they don't have a lot of stuff, i.e., as in Shin Godzilla, they don't have drones. They don't have long-range ballistic missiles, which is what the Americans use. They don't have that stuff. So for them to have a nuclear submarine with ballistic nuclear missiles on it, that's a problem.
Absolutely, yeah.
The next key component in the character side of things, which we're going to go into, is Emmy, The Futurian, who's also Japanese, as she exposits to us, the audience, as if we couldn't figure it out ourselves, who ends up turncoating her cohorts in order to save her country. Oh boy, where do we begin? Well, for starters, she was the one who left the Dorats behind to eventually be mutated into Ghidorah by the nuclear tests in 54. If it was M11, the android that's programmed to carry out specific orders made by certain individuals like Wilson and Grenchiko, that was the one who left the Dorats behind without Emmy's knowledge, then that'd be one thing. But no, Emmy was the one who did it, and she even dodges Miki's question of their whereabouts right before she tells M11 to time warp back to 1992. In fact, when Miki, Terasawa, and Mizaki are standing in front of the dinosaur and expressing pity for him as he's bleeding out on the ground there, Emmy's the one who tells them to remain focused on the task at hand, making it very clear that she's fully committed to this mission. Then, when she sees what Wilson and Grenchiko are doing with their newly created monster, or rather when Wilson and Grenchiko blurt their master plan out in front of everybody, including Emmy, she turns against them and vows to retaliate against them. So with this strong negative reaction of hers taken into account, this begs the question, did she never once ever question why the Dorats were going to be left on Lagos Island, at all? Did she never push back on or even question any part of Wilson and Grenchiko's plan whatsoever? Did she just go along with it no matter what, no question or thought in mind, and just hoped that the Dorats were not going to be somehow part of a big secret master plan with ulterior intentions? Is Emmy just stupid and the film simply failed to be aware of that? Anyways, moving right along. Emmy then goes on to tell Terasawa how Japan will become a stronger nation thanks to a prosperous economic future, where it will buy up whole nations across the world and become the most powerful nation out there. More on this later. I know I say that a lot, but trust me. So she says this when before that she was in the same room as Wilson and Grenchiko when they warned/lied to the government that Japan would be destroyed by Godzilla right around the time when the country was supposed to have its economic golden age. Emmy is also a bit of a hypocrite here because she tells Terasawa that changing the title of his book to ensure greater success for it is against the rules for time travel. When later on, she outright states that Shindo's business practices would go on to create Japan's economic boom. She just straight up spoils it for everybody. She's basically saying that what they're doing is the correct course for Japan's golden age. And this advice would definitely be taken into account in order for that company to thrive in the future. Never mind that she's a time traveler whose mission was to literally rewrite history. Just the fact that she actively states what would be considered to be helpful information for a company to thrive in the future that would potentially alter the course of its history, but she's against encouraging Terasawa to make his book all the more successful in the future. It's like if a teacher catches one student cheating on their math test, but then goes on to slip the answers for some of the really hard questions on that same test to another. So I beg to ask, does Emmy care about the rules of time travel or not, movie? Which is it? Or maybe she's just inbred considering that Terasawa seems to like her a lot and may potentially harbor some disturbing tendencies. This channel does not condone or intend to inspire incest, by the way, just so we're clear. Also, Emmy's plan to subdue Godzilla Mecha King Ghidorah is so underwhelming since it all just boils down to dropping him into the ocean. Keeping him contained in Shinjuku makes sense, but having Emmy's end goal be for her to send him back to the sea is kinda dumb since it begs the question. Does Emmy not know that Godzilla was contained inside a volcano at one point in time for 5 years between the events of Return of Godzilla and Godzilla vs. Biollante? If she is aware of this fact, then how could she possibly know that her friends and ancestor, and by extension her country, will be safe and sound just by her dropping Godzilla into the ocean, which would be considered a much less lethal method of dispatching him than sending him down a volcano once she leaves? If she isn't aware of Godzilla surviving inside a volcano, then what kept her from doing her research, especially when that research can be found in Terasawa's book? which we are explicitly shown that she has. So many questions. So many questions. And we haven't even gotten to Wilson and Grenchiko yet, who may actually be, let's just say, as exceptional of individuals as her. So in conclusion, Emmy doesn't earn our sympathy or us rooting for her, especially towards the end when she pilots Mecha King Ghidorah, due to how the film tries to hand-wave the moral responsibility she has for playing such an integral role in her fellow Futurians' plans. Plus, she's also kind of stupid, and the film doesn't realize the full extent of her stupidity that is on display. As far as Terasawa, our leading man, is concerned, well, I wouldn't say that he's all that great, but he's not a terrible lead. He has a decent bit of personality to him, and he is fairly active in the plot, such as when he participates in stopping the Futurians and when he's trying to understand the story about the dinosaur on Lagos Island at the beginning. He does have some terrible lines, though, such as the Dirty Harry reference he makes before sabotaging the mothership. But on a more substantive note, he gets depressed in the middle of the film due to finding out through Emmy that his future book would be a critical and financial flop, as opposed to him unknowingly being part of a plot that has resulted in his country being on fire. Then, when Emmy shows up, he doesn't become immediately hostile towards her, considering that she was the one who led the mission to remove Godzilla from history. I guess he likes her that much to be pretty chills with her showing up unannounced, all things considered. But then again, we do find out at the tail end of the film that Terasawa and Emmy are both blood relatives. Okay, you know what? I'm going to stop right there and say that despite some questionable bits of writing regarding him, Terasawa is decent as far as characters are concerned, especially given the cast which we're dealing with here. But even he has problems. We also have Miki Seguza, the psychic with a telepathic link to Godzilla, who started as having a decently sized role in the previous film, only to be just kinda there in this film, where it seemed like the writer wasn't entirely sure what to even do with her. There isn't really anything character breaking going on with her, but there are some weird moments involving her, such as how she just assumes that the dinosaur on Lagos is Godzilla just by seeing him, to where she says that she's sure of it, as if there was a bit of doubt on her mind at first, when the main reason she was brought along for this time travel mission in the first place was for her to use her powers in order to properly identify the dinosaur. So really, Miki being here is just a redundancy that ultimately backfires for the Futurians anyways when she asks about the Dorats. Other than that though, Miki isn't really given all that much to do in this film, nor is she really capitalized on as a character going forward until Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2. Slight digression, Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2 is unironically good, I'm not kidding. So yeah, Miki Seguza isn't badly written, nor does she do anything that's incongruent to her character. She's just, well, kinda there, like I said.
That supercomputer. More evidence from, what was the girl's name from the future?
Emmy.
Emmy. More evidence that she's definitely inbred stupid. They must be. Her great granddad or whatever was looking at her going, "Oh yeah, I'd hit that absolutely." Going,
Yes!
I like it because you're here. He's like, that family is absolutely inbred, and it's made clearer by the fact that she is terminally stupid. I mean, there's all the bits you brought up before, and what everybody has brought up before, but then she brings up that supercomputer and says they're going to give this to Japan. And when I heard that, I was like, what do you mean they're going to give it to Japan? They're destroying Japan. Why would they give them a highly advanced supercomputer? And my logic for making that make sense is that that's what they told her at the start of the trip. Like, yeah, we're just going back to help them. And yes, we've got this supercomputer. We're definitely going to give them this supercomputer. It's definitely going to be a thing. And then after they double-crossed her and betrayed her, she still thinks they're going to give that computer to them. And she's just that stupid.
Yeah. Yeah, that there's a lot to unpack with that character. you could say that family is also pretty inbred stupid because, like, you know, I've kind of been thinking like that Terasawa was like probably one of the only characters in the film who's like mildly okay, pretty much, because like but yeah, as I think about it, it's like, yeah, he probably is a little bit dumb because like the fact that she just shows up at his place, and he seems like he's not like remotely like just going like, yo, you're one of the, yo, what the hell, girl, like did you know about anything? Like, he should have been more hostile towards her about, you know, the whole thing with Ghidorah, pretty much. But I guess he was too upset about his book not doing all that well, you know, critically or financially to, you know, to let that bother him. Even though he was
Also
part
the
of the
horn.
time travel mission.
I mean, also the horn. Let's not forget that. The inbred horn.
Oh yeah.
But you just reminded me of another inbred stupidity. She says to him, because he's talking about rewriting his book, and she says, "You can't do that. That's against the rules of time travel." And then later on, they're talking about one company or another. I can't remember. They mention a company name, and she says out loud, that company grows steadily right up until the 23rd, 4th century, whenever the hell they're from. I was just like, sorry, you just told somebody from the past, like, really, like, helpful, like, information with regards to making money. So why the hell is it not all right for him to change the name of a book, but completely fine for you to give out financial info? That's literally the plot of Back to the Future 2.
Oh my god. Oh god. Oh, okay.
Traveling in time.
Yep, there you go. He says, maybe if I changed it to traveling in time, and she hovers down the stairs. I don't know how she got in the house. And then she says, that will be against the rules.
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
now
Yeah.
going to
She
try
said,
and find... Oh, I found it. That was surprisingly... I don't know how I managed that.
Teo is mammoth. That company grows steadily right up to the 23rd century.
yeah, I heard that.
Yeah. So she gives away, like, quite significant financial information.
God. Oh no. Oh god. Yeah. I'm like Marlo. This is nuts. This is nuts, guys.
This is Godzilla. This is another film where the more you look into, the more you dig, the more you find, the worse it gets.
Terasawa isn't dumb. He's just crazy. It could be a little, yeah, probably a little, maybe a little bit there for sure. You can kind of see that. Anyways, they might not have taken everything from Back to the Future, but they 100% took the incest.
Oh god, don't make me do that. I'm coughing.
Oh god.
So, as you all may have noticed, I had a lot to say about certain characters in this film, but we're still not even technically done with the character side of things just yet. With that said, let's talk about the Futurians' plan for a bit here. For quite a bit, actually. Because their plan has so much wrong with it, and it should have fallen totally apart at several points to where it's astounding. First off, they blow up a couple military choppers that were only out in reconnaissance. They blew up and killed a bunch of military personnel unprovoked, and after a news report, no one in the seats of power questioned the Futurians on it. This event should raise all kinds of red flags, yet here we are. And this was all for no good reason, because the Futurians, just by having their mothership land in the middle of an open field, are essentially inviting the Japanese government to communicate with them. If anything, blowing those two choppers up would invite Japan to consider a counterattack on them. The military does respond by sending armaments over to the UFO's location, which is an appropriate response, but there's no addressing of the two choppers going missing or getting destroyed a minute after it happens, at least in film time. It's as if this scene never even happened because its relevance to the film's plot lives and dies where it takes place. This kind of reminds me of something similar that another Godzilla movie would go on to do. Cough. Phase array radar and Shin Godzilla. Cough. Secondly, why did the Futurians even bother stopping by in 1992 to tell the government about their plan when it's supposed to involve Godzilla literally being erased from history? Or rather, why did they even bother stopping in the year 1992 just to tell anybody about their plan at all, for any reason? Why didn't they just go straight to 1944 after they got their plan all figured out, or figured out in a sense, and got their time machine? Oh, right, because if they did that, then our heroes wouldn't be able to stop them or even realize what their endgame was. Third, since Shindo gave Terasawa his photos of the dinosaur, why didn't he provide the photos to the Futurians? And if he did, why did the Futurians decide to bring Terasawa, Miki, and Mizaki along for the trip back in time when the soon-to-be Godzilla was the only dinosaur that was ever documented or cited by anybody who was on Lagos Island back in World War II? Thus making the photos all that was needed to identify the dinosaur. If anything, bringing extra people along would only make the action of leaving the Dorats behind seem all the more suspicious to people who aren't in on the Futurians' secret agenda. Fourth, were the Futurians seriously just banking on the Dorats not being discovered by anybody who may happen to be on Lagos Island between 1944 and 54? Or having something else happen to them, like some natural predator on the island going around and killing them? Now, this next point kind of more pertains to the world building in the Heisei era more so than about the Futurians' plan, but it does kind of relate. What if the United States, after the war was over, made it an announcement that many of their brave soldiers were killed on Lagos by some unspecified force, and that it would be advisable for Japan to address this matter, since the families and loved ones of all those soldiers who died would want answers? Also, apparently, because this matter is more suitable for scientists than soldiers, according to a certain U.S. naval captain, the island was never investigated at any point whatsoever by either the Japanese nor anybody for what may have killed dozens of U.S. soldiers during the war that would fit the description of a creature that resembles a giant dinosaur. Heck, there were many witnesses in the Navy, and you're telling me not one of them came out and said, oh yeah, a dinosaur, totally killed our boys back there. He may seem kind of crazy, but I would like to think that there's more people out there than just a handful of Japanese war veterans also spewing out such rhetoric. And considering the bombardments that took place on that island due to all the US battleships firing on the dinosaur, for all everybody knows, the creature would be dead by the time the investigation is started, and its remains would be expected to be lying around for scientists to examine them. So basically, the Futurians seem to be banking on a great deal of convenience for this part of their plan to even remotely pan out. Fifth, the fact that Wilson and Grenchiko never thought to double check on whether or not the Bering Sea would have any nuclear waste at any point in time between 1944 and 1992 before even enacting on the plan is just plain stupid on their part. So I beg to ask, how could a trio of people whose master plan involves time travel and rewriting history not take any of this into account by simply doing their research on history? Does the internet not exist in 2204? Does the Earth Union have a policy that bans research? Or are Wilson and Grenchiko inbred stupid just like Emmy? On a less significant note, or a note that doesn't involve a whole lot of plot or character breaking issues, but rather it's more of a criticism on a certain cosmetic choice, why isn't M11 implanted with a recording device inside him as opposed to being required to wear a very conspicuous looking helmet? He's an android from the future, for crying out loud. You're telling me that the Futurians wouldn't have the means to make that happen so that he wouldn't look so goofy? At least especially when we see him running around in that, which we'll get back into that, by the way. Also, the security on the mothership is just pathetic. Not only is Emmy able to reprogram M11 without anyone watching over her, despite her explicit objections to her colleague's plan, and not only are Emmy and M11 able to sneak Terasawa on board in order to enact their sabotaging of the ship without anyone spotting them, but this security force just straight up allows M11 to get the drop on them despite being all aware of his capabilities as an android. Going back to Wilson and Grenchiko specifically, and in regards to this point, Wilson even sent M11 to spy on Emmy after he witnessed her sneaking out of the mothership. Considering her very vocal objections towards their plan, it would certainly be in Wilson and Grenchiko's best interest to overcompensate with their security in case Emmy were to attempt to sabotage them after she's brought back. But of course, they don't do that because reasons, I guess. Oh, and if that wasn't convenient enough for our heroes to overcome their enemies, why was the mothership designed to have a failsafe system to send itself back to its original time that's active as soon as the alarms go off, but it's sat on a timer for 20 minutes before it's sent back? Shouldn't the failsafe be that it's sent back, like, oh, I don't know, as soon as the alarms go off? What if there was a cataclysmic event occurring that would need them to get back to their own time immediately? Like a meteor that's about to hit, or a giant monster that's gonna attack them, let's just say. Oh, right. The reason why the mothership is on a ticking clock is because if it wasn't, our heroes would be trapped on it and would be sent back to the future along with Wilson and Grenchiko, thus voiding their attempts to destroy the mothership, and we wouldn't have the payoff of Godzilla blowing up the mothership with our villains inside. And we can't let anything get in the way of that payoff, now can we? Also, I find it to be a bit priceless that Emmy was unaware of this failsafe until now, though that's assuming the failsafe was there the whole time and not invented by Wilson and Grenchiko recently and off-screen. But even if that was the case, we're still left with the issue of the failsafe being set up that way in the first place. So at this point, the Futurians make most of all the invasion forces in Godzilla movies past and yet to come look competent by comparison. But here's the most surreal thing about all this. Wilson and Grenchiko are portrayed as nothing more than a couple of villains from a Saturday morning cartoon, and their plan has more holes in it than your average slice of Swiss cheese. But when you really think about it, all they were trying to do was to ensure that one country wouldn't eventually attempt to buy up whole continents worth of countries, just as Emmy tells Terasawa that from 1992 onward, Japan would go into the biggest economic boom it has ever embarked on. Side note, this economic boom that this film establishes is never referenced or brought up or even implied again in any of the Heisei films to come. Just a thought. Anyways, back on track. If one country were to try to buy up so many countries, let alone whole continents worth of countries, why would any other nation allow it to happen, or at least not have something to say about it? Doesn't the Earth Union have some sort of checks and balances in place to keep that from happening? To prevent a country from monopolizing the world's economy? What is even the state of the world at that point in time to where Japan would even be able to buy up entire countries like Disney buying up whole studios, let alone the entirety of South America, Africa, and Europe, to the point where no other nation would even be able to challenge it? If the countries in said continents were, for example, going into default or something of that nature, then what even caused those countries to be in such position? For example, did Godzilla for some reason decide to attack them instead of Japan, and those attacks resulted in them needing to go into default? Did all those countries go into a state of depression to where, in order for their economies to be sustained or salvaged, they'd have to let a whole nother country buy them up? These are questions which the film never answers, and so all we're left with is a film that, whether intentionally or not, gives off a pro-imperialist tone that paints the individuals who seek to maintain checks and balances in the world as the bad guys. And how does it do that? By having the Futurians create a giant monster and use it to kill thousands of innocent people in order to force Japan into submission. No nuance, no gray area, nothing. Wilson and Grenchiko are the bad guys 100% end of discussion because they don't want a world where one country can become a global empire. This tone could also explain why Shindo isn't condemned nor treated harshly for being the private owner of nuclear weapons that are keeping watch of any potential for Japan being under attack by another nation as opposed to a giant monster, because he's the owner of a large corporation that's important to Japan's economic growth, thus making him a key figure in that golden age coming to fruition, which would set the stage for Japan to buy up nations. Seems a bit weird, doesn't it? But let's get into the wrap-up, at least as far as the Futurians are concerned. So at this point, it's safe to say that the Futurians, more specifically Wilson and Grenchiko, are arguably some of the dumbest non-monster antagonists in the entire Godzilla franchise, despite the film's best efforts to make it seem like they are actually fairly intelligent, but they're just outsmarted by something else or had stuff happen beyond their control. They're certainly the dumbest villains in the Heisei era, and that's by a very clear mile on that front. Their plan is busted no matter how we look at it, with or without the time travel mechanics in mind, and they're totally inept at executing their plan on top of that. So the plot has to break itself at several turns in order to facilitate such a plan, even getting as far as it does here.
The Futurians just chilled in the present after the time travel. I'm kind of like going through like the comments like a little bit out of order there, so. Yeah, I mean, they could chip. Yeah, I mean that was kind of the thing. But the problem though is that they can't, like, in the timeline where they're chilling in, it can't, like, the timeline that they're chilling in is the one where they didn't move the dinosaur from Lagos Island. So, like, the point is, like, that point shouldn't even be accessible for, like, unless, like. They pretty much should have just, like, brought the mothership with them in, to 1944 to World War II, and then just did the mission thing there, and then just flat, jump forward in time with the mothership to where, I don't even know. I'm trying to figure out a way to try to make this work, and I can't. It's just. It's so busted.
It doesn't work.
It can't. It's not like this. It can't work.
Stop. They didn't need to stop where they stopped. They didn't need to go to 1992, introduce themselves, get all these people, and blah blah blah, then go back to 1945, 4, whenever it was, and do the thing. They could have just gone to the Second World War, did the thing, then gone back to the future. Hey, and.
Yeah.
Then, like, seeing the results, and if the results weren't what they wanted, they could then muck around with it again, which is the biggest problem with time travel, because if you can alter stuff and have no real consequences to you, then you can do that all the time and never have any problems.
Yeah. It's just a thing. Like, or just
you have the automatic win button.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh, I've just thought of something.
Yeah.
Oh boy, what?
So, Zimzilla, I don't know if you, don't know when you started listening.
I just started listening.
Oh, I've come up with a theory as to why. Oh God, I've forgotten her name again.
Emmy.
Future girl, Emmy.
Yeah.
I've come up with a theory why she's terminally stupid. She's well, I'm just going on the theory that she's massively inbred, based on the fact that her great grandfather wants to hit that, and she then says to him, like, "Yeah, I really like being here because of you." So I'm just assuming that her entire family tree is like inbred, which is why she's so stupid in this film.
Oh no.
I'm now because the only evidence we have for Japan being prosperous is her ?
Mm-hmm.
Because I don't think the Futurians, the other two Futurians, the two English guys, I don't think they say anything about, like, the success of Japan. I can't remember now.
There's so
much
the only
stupid
thing they
going on.
allude to is the fact that they say Godzilla's going to destroy Japan, and then after they get revealed, they're going to say that Japan actually will be destroyed. But they believe, because, like, they're essentially like maniacs, that by taking the time machine, when they go back in time, they're going to change their future instead of changing the future of a new timeline.
This is why it's so complicated.
This is why
The only evidence the only evidence we really have for Japan being this super successful superpower is inbred girl just coming up with this story about Japan owning the planet. And it's like, Is that an actual thing, or is that her just coming up with a story in her head about how wonderful Japan is,
Yeah.
just to encourage people? Is it entirely in her head?
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
is
like,
the
I think-
actual timeline of Japan being destroyed by Godzilla the actual timeline?
Mhm.
So with all the writing issues in mind, one can't help but wonder, how did this get made? And what was the thought process which occurred in order to get it made? Well, let's get into that, shall we? So, when Godzilla vs. Biollante was released, it didn't do so hot at the box office, essentially being below Toho's expectations. They mainly attributed the film's underperformance to the fact that it didn't feature Godzilla going up against a recognizable, pre-established adversary, as opposed to the more original one in the form of Biollante. Not only that, but around the same time, Back to the Future Part 2 was also released in Japan, and it was a big hit there, thus stealing the Big G's thunder at the box office. So Kazuki Omori was brought in to do a follow-up that would pit Godzilla against his old nemesis, King Ghidorah, and he was also inspired to make the film more about time travel in order to ride on the popularity of films such as Back to the Future and Terminator to ensure success for the finished film. Whether it's the inclusion of an android from the future and time travelers having the goal which involves changing the past in order to create a new present/future, to said time travelers using an aerial vehicle as a time machine, as well as the inclusion of incest, it's rather easy to see where the film was taking its notes from. Heck, I'll go a step further and theorize, meaning that I can only say this in the terms of it being alleged, that the inclusion of Mecha King Ghidorah, a product of all the time-traveling shenanigans which ensue in this film, may have been the result of Toho wanting Kazuki Omori to plant a potential seed for Mecha Godzilla to be used in a later film. That would explain why Mecha Ghidorah had to be at the bottom of the ocean by the end of the story, because his remains would need to be accessible for Japan's defense force to get a hold of it in order to construct their new mechanical titan in the near future. Considering that Toho was banking on the return of more recognizable faces for their next few entries being what will sustain the Heisei series, who's to say that there weren't any producer's notes being passed on to Omori to take into account for his script at the time? Again, this is all alleged, but certain details here seem to line up just a bit too well for it to be coincidental. But, no matter what the reason is for this story to be the way that it was, if you ask me, they should have just stuck with introducing aliens in the Heisei timeline. Sure, it would have been a bit cliched for a Godzilla film to feature alien invaders controlling a giant monster, and it's not to say that all Godzilla movies involving alien invaders were good, but at least we wouldn't have to worry about a catastrophically broken time travel story, and it would have at the very least stayed within Toho's guidelines for the film to play it safe and recognizable for maximum box office potential. In fact, aliens being responsible for Ghidorah's creation would also lend to them having the technological capabilities to create a cyborg by the end of the film. And that tech could potentially be applied by mankind to create some mechs down the line. And all that would still remain congruent within the series' overarching narrative. Just a thought. Now, when it comes to how Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah is put together in the kaiju-related spectacle, or just the technical side of things in general, this is where the film is able to shine, but only when we strictly focus on the kaiju action. As far as stuff that's outside of the kaiju action, that's where we start to see issues in even the film's technical fidelity. But for now, let's talk about the monsters and their action scenes for a bit. In terms of designs, Godzilla remains consistent with how he appeared in the last film, though tweaked a bit in order to make him a whole lot beefier and more fierce looking than before, thanks to the power boost he gets later on. I mean, what can I say? Goji's Heisei design is pretty awesome overall, and it's no exception here. And as far as King Ghidorah is concerned, it's a great and even intimidating look he's got going on. It takes the classic design from the Showa era, which we all know and love, and adds a bit of flair to it. Then we get him as Mecha King Ghidorah, and the kaiju machine hybrid look to him and the showcasing of the creature's abilities is just simply too cool to ignore. It's a shame that the logistics and the plot for how this cool thing is actualized don't really add up all that well, and that it's pretty insanely stupid for Emmy's control consoles and cockpit to be placed directly on the cyborg's chest, where she could easily be killed by a shot at Godzilla's atomic breath, especially considering her plan to drop him into the ocean. But still, metal is a F creature, though, which is also what I would say about Godzilla and normal Ghidorah, more or less. And as far as how the monster attacks and battles are done on a technical level, it's certainly a grand spectacle to behold. The Heisei Godzilla films have always had some really solid technical fidelity when it comes to showcasing Godzilla and other kaiju attacking cities, and this film is no exception on that front. While there's a lot of emphasis on beam-oriented combat due to apparently how Ghidorah's suitmation is done, and especially when the three-headed dragon gets his cybernetic implants, it's mainly to do with how the weight of the Ghidorah and the Mecha Ghidorah suits did seem to limit how moments of close-quarters combat are executed. But even then, Mecha Ghidorah standing in one single place is congruent due to Emmy trying to prevent Godzilla from advancing further, and there are plenty of instances where normal Ghidorah is able to fly around as well as get up close and personal with Godzilla, to the point of trying to constrict him to death. Not to mention, the more violent nature of the kaiju battles makes for some pretty cool and brutal moments, such as when Godzilla uses his atomic breath to decapitate Ghidorah's middle head, thus facilitating the middle head being replaced with the robot head. So yeah, there's some great effects work at play when it comes to the kaiju-centric scenes, and it does lend to some pretty good old-fashioned Toho Godzilla spectacle involving the destruction of various cities, as well as the clashing of titans. That being said, however, there are other moments where the technical fidelity in the film really falters, whether it involves blue screen or especially when it comes to M11 and how he more or less gets around. M11 is shown to be not just super strong, but also capable of running super fast thanks to him being a highly advanced android. While I understand that the filmmakers were working within a very restrained budget, I'm sorry, but how can anyone look at M11 pulling a Benny Hill or looking like he's awkwardly skiing as opposed to running and not laugh their heads off at it? So yeah, like I said, there's imperfections in the film's technical side of things, but even then, they're not quite enough to take away from how well done the kaiju set pieces are overall, especially when we get to the point where Godzilla and Ghidorah are versus one another. And so we come to the final point of discussion in regards to Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah. While the film does have its share of fans, it certainly isn't recognized as the most solid Godzilla film overall. Many of the issues, which I've highlighted throughout this chungus of a video, are cited as the reasons why this film is considered bad by various groups. Meanwhile, on the flip side, we have folks like James Rolfe considering this as the best film in the Heisei era, despite the vast number of issues that can be easily found in its writing, which should keep this film from holding such a moniker by all accounts. In his Godzilla for Beginners video leading up to the release of KOTM 2019, he even went on to recommend it as the one film in the Heisei era for people just starting out on Godzilla for the most shallow reasons imaginable, i.e. because people would have to be introduced to King Ghidorah anyways, plus the fact that Mecha King Ghidorah is also added in as a bonus to coincide with the time travel story. I'm sorry, but no, this is pretty much the last film I would recommend anyone to watch in order to be properly introduced to the Heisei films, especially when the Return of Godzilla is just sitting right there. As far as films that introduce people to Ghidorah potentially, I would just introduce them to Ghidorah, the three-headed monster, if I want to do that. Look, I know I've been referencing James Rolfe quite a bit in the past few videos up to this point, and I promise that I'll stop, at least for a while, but movies like Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah should not be a proud representative of what the Godzilla franchise ought to be. It really shouldn't. Unfortunately, folks like James Rolfe and Up From the Depths, who in the latter's case gave the film a 4-star review, who each have a great deal of influence in the landscape of discussion on Godzilla media for the modern age, keep providing this film a strong platform, and that allows for an environment that could perpetuate the notion of movies like this being considered as a quality Goji film when it really isn't. I will say this now, as it's been said by many others before me, and it will more than likely be said by many others after me. A film is not just a bunch of cool scenes involving pure spectacle or a bunch of good character moments in isolation. It's a sequence of all those things that are meant to come together in a cohesive whole. Unfortunately, Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, despite having some good scenes involving monsters and or humans, does not come together all that well in a cohesive whole. The film is put together as some good scenes that are strung together by an utterly broken plotline. To digress just a bit here, Avengers Endgame sadly has undergone a similar fate as Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, for me at least. I can appreciate the things that it gets right, such as the conclusion of Tony Stark's story as well as Black Widow's story, and a lot of the highly satisfying payoffs / moments throughout, especially during the film's final act, which would either warrant excitement or even bring a tear or two out of me. But I also have to acknowledge that the film fails at establishing its rules of time travel in a coherent and logically consistent way. And alas, those failures were to ensure that we got those specific payoffs, as well as to set up things going forward and to give us fan service and callbacks to previous iconic moments in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And some of these payoffs, like Captain America's final scene, even go as far as to break the film's already flimsy and not well thought out time travel rules several times over. Now don't get me wrong, Endgame has other problems in it that bring it down as a finale to the MCU's Infinity Saga. Cough. Fat Thor cough. But the inconsistent and downright incoherent time travel mechanics, as well as how the time heist was conducted by the Avengers themselves, are still pretty sizable flaws in the film's writing due to how integral it all is in order to get us to that grand finale. The overall point here is that whether the great moments in a film involve either an epic battle between two opposing forces or the end of a certain character's run, the story, which these moments are a part of, has to function in order for those moments to have the intended amount of weight which the writers wanted their audience members to feel. But even if all of that isn't the case, the reason for someone to justifiably give Iron Man's heroic sacrifice in Endgame a pass and not Shindo's demise in Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah is the fact that Iron Man, using the Infinity Stones to defeat Thanos and save the universe, only to die as a result of it, was congruent with how this character's journey was built up over the course of the 11 years during which the Infinity Saga ran. Meanwhile, Shindo's story begins and ends in Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, and his limited screen time and certain things which we know about him and what he's done since that fateful day on Lagos Island isn't sufficient enough to have his death at the hands of the Big G earn the gravitas which Katsuki Omori wanted us to feel. I understand why certain fans would still use this scene as an example of a good dramatic moment in the Godzilla franchise, but that's only so if we are to look at it as a scene in isolation. Heck, to lend an olive branch, there are certain moments in something like Godzilla Final Wars that I myself would and even have considered to be worthy of the One Monstrous Moment moniker. But it's only as those scenes in isolation because I am fully aware of how flawed that film is as a whole. And like I said, in order to properly judge a film like Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, or Final Wars, or Shin Godzilla, or Godzilla Kong the New Empire, or Avengers Endgame, or heck, any film for that matter, we can't just look at a select number of scenes in isolation, because there's still a bunch of movie that happens before and after those respective moments. So, long story short, and near as I can tell, Shindo's death may be one monstrous moment, but it's still just one moment in a sea of poor storytelling which encompasses Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah. And so on that note, I think it's time for us to bring this essay video to a much needed close because, honestly, what else is there left to say about it now? Boy, oh boy, what a journey this has been. I knew I was going to have a lot to say about this one, but I did not expect this essay video to balloon the way that it did. So, when it is all said and done, and admittedly, it pains me to say this, but I'm going to have to remain steadfast and say it, Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah is overall objectively bad in terms of filmmaking. The script bends and breaks at many turns as a result of it being beholden to facilitating certain payoffs in the plot, as well as to put certain characters on paths that the writers need them to go on without properly earning the means to get them on said paths. And even the film's technical aspects are a mix between some great effects which involve the title monsters, and some subpar to laughably awful effects that occur outside of the kaiju spectacle. The biggest shame about all this is that this film has a sizable number of ideas that sound pretty great when you hear someone pitch them to you, but they needed to be done in a much better, more cohesive, and internally consistent narrative. A story that ties the origins of Godzilla to become relevant in present-day events, with a World War II veteran being a part of said story, while also having that woven in thematically to the complexities of Godzilla's relations with the people of Japan, as he both attacks and defends them against an arguably bigger threat, could have been great. But alas, a great iteration of such a story this was not. And that's why I would call Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah the worst entry in the Heisei era. There are worse Godzilla films out there in the franchise as a whole, and it's not to say that this is the only Heisei Goji film that doesn't hold up under a critical lens. In fact, I still would personally rather watch this film again before I would watch most bad to awful films in other franchises any day of the week, because it does have its entertainment value, whether intended or not. But I cannot, in good conscience, call Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah a solid entry in the Big G's legacy. In fact, I'd rather we look at this film as an example of what not to do when telling any type of sci-fi story, whether it be kaiju related or about time travel. And it's important to remember that even though we can't rewrite history, we can still learn from it, and hope that just by learning from it, we won't end up repeating it. Or at least that's what I'm hoping will be the case. I don't know. And so, that's about it for my essay video on Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah. I would like to give a huge thanks to you all for giving this big chungus of a video a watch and for sticking with it to the end. I would also like to give a big shout out and special thanks to Zimzilla99, Thanatos0x, Fristy Madge, and C Animus for their further insights on Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, as you may have seen and heard from the various clips of one of the live streams which I featured throughout this video. These further insights not only helped in the development of the script for this essay video, but some points which they brought up, such as, for example, C. Animus's point about the Futurian supercomputer and his theory on Emmy, as well as me and the rest of the groups breaking down of the film's time travel rules and mechanics during the stream, have also added that much more to the overall discussion of how the film does, or rather doesn't, hold up on a writing level. So once again, big thanks to all those fine folks there, and I recommend you all to check them out. Now, is there anything else which I haven't brought up yet before we go? Oh, right. So, fun little trivia for you all regarding this particular project. I was originally going to release this as a multi-part essay video series like I did for films such as GMK, Shin Godzilla, Monster Hunter 2020, and the MonsterVerse films pre-GXK, just to name a few. However, I decided to simply do away with the prospect of a multi-part series, and I've also made the decision to make a slight tweak to how I conduct my projects going forward. Now, it's safe for me to admit that the way I do things on this channel in the past was, and perhaps still is, inspired by the likes of Mahler and his critiques on certain pieces of media. And I figured that a multi-part series for one movie, split up in reasonably short chunks and in a particular structure, would be more accessible. But as time went on, not only have I taken into account the feedback of some folks out there who think it would be better for me to do one big video as opposed to several smaller ones, but I've even started to consider that doing one big essay video would help my content in the long run in order to avoid potential redundancy in said projects going forward. I'm still proud of what I've done in the past in regards to projects done in the format of a multi-part series, and it's not that I will be doing away with this format altogether, since there is always the potential of a project or two warranting it, whether it be a season of television or even a trilogy of films which are meant to be seen as one complete package. However, the multi-part series style of me making videos will no longer be a regular thing on this channel from here on out. So yeah, just want to make this tidbit of information known in case anybody may be wondering. Now, in terms of what's to come, I will be sure to cover just about anything in the future. Well, anything that's monster related, that is. I won't be saying any names in particular, but I will be sure to signpost what is to come from here going forward. Once again, thanks to you for watching, and until my next video or project, whatever it may end up being, I will see you all later.